Thank you, John. That was incredible. And you could have talked for an awful lot longer, except we've got a lot to get through today. I picked up from that, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. John talked there about his career as a Scientology bus driver. He also briefly mentioned another transport issue, the freight train on Venus. This is all available online if anybody wants to know. We're moving again to another area of transport, and our next speaker actually spent time on board the Scientology boat, the Apollo, as a child. And I'd like to welcome Sharone Stainforth to the stage right now. Thank you, Sharone.
Hello. Sorry? All right. Yeah? Okay. Sorry, not terribly good at this. And I am going to be reading off notes because I'll drift off all over the place otherwise.
That's okay.
No, not good. Right, I moved to East Grinstead in 1963 with my family. And we moved house in as many times as 4 years. My father worked at St Hill as a cashier, and that was why we moved there as a family. I was 8 to 9 years old when I did the children's communication courses known as the TRs. These are something that all people who join Scientology do, regardless of age. In the mid to early part of 1967, I lived in a house where there were many boarders, all Scientologists and all doing courses at St Hill. Amongst these were various people whom I've never seen again, but one of them was a matador from, well, I thought he was from Spain, but I'm not sure about that now. I would like to point out that this is kind of typical of a Scientologist child's life, so this is why I'm bringing this particular thing up. Ernie resided at somewhere called Cooper's Wood, and on several occasions, whilst supposedly teaching me martial arts, he touched me inappropriately. The Scientology owners of the house quickly dealt with the situation by sending me to bed and the next day taking me out while they quickly got rid of him. But they never got rid of him far enough. What they did was send him away from that house, but it was covered up and not talked about again. He later became a Class 8 auditor and a Kakan, which means he's untouchable in L. Ron Hubbard's world. He can do as he pleases. In October of 1967, I left for Tunisia with my father to join the Royal Scotsman, and I became a Sea Org member, signing a billion-year contract at the age of 10. My father queried this because I was so young, and the decision became mine to stay because I had made such a big thing about being with him, because that's what I wanted to do, be with my father. So that's what happened there. In the roughly 20 months I spent on board the Royal Scotsman, which later became the Apollo, I barely got any time to spend with my father at all, apart from the occasional lib days. I became a Commodores messenger, even though LRH himself commented on the fact that I was a little young, but we would give it a try. I was a messenger until I left in mid-1969, and as a messenger, I spent many hours sitting outside L. Ron Hubbard's office waiting to deliver messages, dispatches, fetch people. I spent many hours on the bridge when at sea, and I also followed him around when he walked the decks. During 1968, we sailed around many ports, which are now very vague in my mind, some 45 years later. However, many things happened on board the ship that I'm never likely to forget. I bore witness to people being locked up on the Apollo. Now, throughout the years, many people have been locked up, and on the Apollo, none more so. There was a man shortly after, I would say a few months into my time there, whom I never saw. I never saw him go in, I never saw him come out, but I could hear him banging on the cabin to be let out daily, all day long. This went on for several days. My first introduction to heavy ethics was when Ron Poots was in a condition of treason and was sanding down the railings. Nobody was allowed to speak to him. Myself and Janice, another messenger, sneaked some food up to him, which was a present from the cook. We weren't supposed to do that. I saw a young girl of about 4 or 5 years old with just the top of her sitting out of the where there was a metal grid, which was the ship's chain locker. This little girl had been crying for hours on end. She was puffy and red, covered in snot, filthy dirty, and I don't know why she was there. We were ushered away. We were told to move. The overboardings happened every single day, particularly in Corfu, and were a constant threat to morale. Every day you wondered if your name would be called out. Would you be the one going over the side today? On one particular day, LRH and some of his aides were up on the top deck watching the proceedings, smiling, laughing, filming, and taking pictures. It was sickening. One time, when John McMasters had been thrown over, later that day he appeared on the deck with his arm in a sling, and a group of us were sitting on some benches. I think I was the only child there on that particular day on the deck, and John was visibly upset. He went on about how mad all this was, and how did we all accept it. No one spoke to him. It was a very sad and sharp reminder that something was desperately wrong. On board the Apollo, as it was later named to ingratiate the Corfuan officials with the advent of setting up an academy on the island, what should have been clear, but wasn't at that point, at least in my mind, I was only a kid, Corfu was the first place that LRH would have liked to have taken over. He was setting up an academy there, but he didn't actually get to take the entire island over. But I think that was the goal at the end of the day. And as, of course, we know, he later crept into Clearwater and took the town of that over instead. Back on the Apollo, I witnessed Bill Deitch and 2 other men locked up in the cattle stalls. People vanished, usually in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. A story always circulated about their bad behaviour. This happened regularly. At a mandatory attendance, LRH had a grown man push a peanut around the decks with his nose. By the time I arrived, Janice having come and got me, we discussed why did we all have to be on the deck? And she said, it's absurd, but this is what's happening. We were laughing because we couldn't believe it. I mean, we were 11 and 12 years old. You know, you're told somebody's doing that. You can't believe it. You really can't believe it. The horror hit me when I stood up, got up there, stood up, and this man stood up from the deck, covered in blood. This was for real. And yes, he really would do something like that. I wasn't the only one ordered up to the crow's nest as punishment, and for punishment, for laughing, I was ordered up to the crow's nest that day. As a party on board, possibly LRH's birthday, I'm not 100% sure, a woman was brought up from below decks, filthy, bedraggled, and dazed. It was horrible, and I think a warning to others that this is what happens to you if you misfay orders. I don't know who she was, and these are just some of the abuses that I know of. I know for a fact there are a lot of others. In early 1969, my father went away on a mission, and I was told he would be gone for 3 weeks. It was a very long time before I would see him again. Before we got thrown out of Corfu, and that is the entire Scientology fleet of ships, Janice and I were put in a condition of liability in the hold for being a security threat. We were watched talking, or should I say trying to talk to Greek boys. The fact that it took forever just to establish each other's names was totally beside the point when you're at war with Smersh. Separated and interrogated separately, we found ourselves down in the hold of the ship, semi-dark, told to chip, rust and clean, and we had to sleep and eat down there. We were not given blankets. We slept sitting up against a girder, and it was cold. Food consisted of bread and I think cheese. Water was the only drink we were given, and I don't remember how long we were down there. But I do think it was a fair while, because when I was finally allowed to come up and gain signatures in order to rejoin the group, which is what you had to do in a condition of liability, my eyes hurt a lot up on the deck. And on that particular day, it was a very dark, dank day. My eyes hurt. My father had been gone ages, and I was worried why he hadn't come back. I asked for permission to go and join him wherever he was, and I had to be careful, as I trusted no one. But Hannah Eltringham's kindly smile had kept me going, so I sought her help. I was seriously depressed after my experiences and endeavoured to be a very good little girl. And one day, Peter brought a newspaper into me and said I should read it. His family had been talking about it. He guarded the door, as it would not have been good for me to have been caught reading this. I skimmed through it, and my father was wanted for a court case concerning Scientology back in England. The Scientologist said he was on a ship in the Mediterranean somewhere and couldn't be contacted. He hadn't been there for months. My depression worsened. The newspaper was the news of the world. It wouldn't be long before I would be joining him. Then surely everything would be all right. It had never occurred to me to rifle through LRH's mail before, and that was part of my duties, taking the mail up to him. Never occurred to me to look at it before, but after the newspaper, I decided I would. One particular day, I found an ethics chit written out about me. It was to have me overboarded. The master-at-arms had been keeping an eye on me, and I wasn't pulling my weight, apparently. I was scared of heights, convinced I would drown. I couldn't swim, and I was literally terrified. Anyway, I put the ethics chit in my pocket because I knew I was leaving in a few days, and I went to the toilet, tore it up into tiny pieces and flushed it away, and then had to avoid the master-at-arms, which was not an easy job. On the day I was due to leave, I was headed across the decks towards the gangplank when I saw the master-at-arms staring at me, and it was all I could do to keep going. I thought he would yell out, "Stop," at any moment, but fortunately he didn't, and I was able to get away. Upon arrival in Denmark, I instantly knew something was wrong. I was driven away in a car by Commander Jill Van Staden, and she was to tell me that my dad was in treason. He hadn't been there for months, and he was now an SP. I was devastated. What was I to do now? I wanted to leave, but I had to be very careful because you didn't just say, "I'm leaving." You didn't just go. I'd seen what happened to people that do that. Most of them were locked up or detained or whatever. Anyway, I had written my mother several times and never heard back from her from the ship. So I was most concerned as to what I was going to do and where I was going to go. The only option I had was to go to my stepmother, whom my father was married to at that time, even though I didn't know her very well. But first of all, I had to request permission to leave and get an education from LRH, which was granted. My stepmother agreed also. In the meantime, my father came back to Aberlund one night. This was the org in Denmark. After I'd gone to bed, he had heard I was there, and he also wanted his money and his passport. And you've got to remember, he'd been gone for months. He had no passport, no money, no nothing. The following morning, Jill Van Staden told me again, "Your father was here last night. We've had to send him away again." I wasn't allowed to see him, and I asked, why wasn't I allowed to see him? And I was told, "You know the rules." The master-at-arms was going on about bull baiting and what a night they'd had of it. And I asked, "What do you mean? Who are you talking about?" He was talking about my father. They'd spent the night interrogating him. Then they had locked him up in a cupboard under the stairs because I'd asked where he'd slept for the night. And then they had thrown him out at 5 a.m. in the morning to make sure there were no witnesses to this fact. I was devastated and in despair by this point. And there's no way I wanted to be anywhere near any of these people. I spent the next few days roaming the surrounding countryside because it was out in the middle of nowhere, crying and calling for my father because I was convinced he would not have left without me. However, he had. A short while before I was due to leave Aberlund, my mother turned up with my 2 younger brothers and her new boyfriend. They were all going to a Swedish org. I was going to spend the weekend with them, which I did. And she said, you can come and stay with us. You can come and live with us in Sweden. The last thing I wanted to do was move to another foreign country with more Scientologists and still be stuck in the position I was in. So I declined, determined to find my father. And I felt the best bet was to get back to England. Just when you think everything can't get any worse, it usually does. And after a very brief, happy interval with my mother, my heart sunk when the master-at-arms from the ship turned up. He'd come to handle me. Later that evening, at a party we had had there, he cornered me in the hall and told me he knew what I'd done with regards to the ethics chit and all the trouble I could be in. He told me that it had gone completely crazy on the ship and he'd had enough and was going back to Sweden himself. He told me there'd be no point in telling anybody about the things that I had seen or heard because all of it was so far-fetched, nobody on earth would believe any of it. And he was right. Who would? And he also told me what they do with crazy people who tell crazy stories. They lock them up and put them away in mental institutions. At the same time, unbeknownst to me, whilst this was going on, the Citizens Commission of Human Rights, thank you very much, was being set up, which was an organised plan to get rid of all psychiatry, which LRH was so against. Excuse me. Right. Things were just about to get worse. I'd always been very scared of the e-meter. The e-meter, to me, as a young child from the age of 6, you were led to believe it was like a god almost. It could read your thoughts. It knew everything you were thinking. You could not lie to it. And that was what I believed. So now I was in really big trouble because I wanted to leave. I couldn't say why I was leaving, and I had to have a security check on the e-meter. This was going to prove very, very frightening, and I was terrified. They ask you lots of questions. There's a big list of them. And I don't remember all the questions, but I do remember a lot of them I didn't even understand. And having read this list of questions as an adult, I can see why I don't even understand them now. But anyway, I had to lie in order to get out of this, and this was going to prove very difficult. The main question I remember was whether I had any unkind thoughts about LRH, Mary Sue Hubbard, or Scientology. Well, I had so many, I wouldn't know where to begin. So I had to give a very gushing appraisal of how wonderful it all was, which wasn't very easy, and I was a nervous wreck. But at the end of it all, I was able to go home, which told me that this contraption that supposedly was this magnificent god that would know everything I was thinking and feeling actually was a load of rubbish. And that was quite a relief in itself. When I finally left Aberlund, I was actually in possession of an e-meter, which I'd been told I would need later on. I didn't really want to buy it, but I had to, because I had to keep up the charade that's why, I was coming back, everything was going to be okay. The plane journey home was surreal, and I couldn't believe I was finally away from these loonies. There was a family on the plane who showed real concern about me. They wanted to know, they asked all the wrong questions at the time for me anyway. Where's your family? Why are you traveling alone? I was only 12. They couldn't understand any of this, and I couldn't understand how on earth I was going to answer them. And I just wanted to be left alone, but they weren't having none of it. And when we arrived in London, they wanted to know why nobody was there late at night to meet me, and I had to lie my way out of that as well. So yes, Scientology does make you a liar in many respects because you're always trying to cover things up. Ah, dear. Anyway, finally getting rid of this family that was so concerned about my welfare, I got into a taxi and headed for East Grinstead. I didn't even have enough money at the other end to pay for the taxi fare. It was gone midnight, and unfortunately, my stepmother, whom should have been there waiting for me, was at St Hill. Surprise, surprise. It's perfectly normal for a 12-year-old to sit in the middle of the countryside all on their own. sitting on a suitcase, gone midnight, apparently. Anyway, she finally appeared and everything was okay, or so I thought. For the first time since I can remember, I was actually taken to a dentist when I got back from the ship, and unfortunately, the bane of my life has always been my teeth, and I had to have 17 major fillings because you never got any form of dental treatment or proper medical care on the ship. And even 45 years ago, you might think, well, okay, that was then. Well, apparently it's still now. Going back to school was dreadful, and I was way behind for my age, the dunce of the class, compounded by that Scientology kid, did nothing to boost my confidence, and I became that dunce. It was easier. I had one non-Scientologist friend, and we'd been friends since we were 5, and she told me she'd seen me on TV on the shrinking world of L. Ron Hubbard. But it was to be many, many years before I finally saw myself on that piece of film footage myself. No one seemed to know where my father was, and that included my stepmother. I had become the local Scientologist babysitter, so all Scientologists could go to St. Hill to do Scientology. One night late, after babysitting, I got home to find a man's jacket on a chair, and I knocked on my stepmother's bedroom door. Much to my amazement, my father opened it. He said it was late, I was to go to bed, and we'd talk in the morning. Well, tomorrow never came. But my father wasn't there in the morning. He'd gone yet again, and I was told by my stepmother, he's an SP, he can't stay here. Yeah, I knew all the rules, only too well. Babysitting became a full-time job out of school, if not for my sister, for other Scientologists. I was sick of it. I resented my stepmother. She spent all her time at St. Hill. Hubbard this, Hubbard that, Scientology this, Scientology that, it's all I ever heard. And all I could think of was, you know nothing. But in actual fact, she didn't, because I wasn't allowed to tell her. I wondered what would happen if I did, and I decided against it as I thought we'd be invaded by Sea Org, and I actually do believe we would have been. I took to walking the streets late at night on my own. Didn't occur to me I shouldn't. Didn't seem to bother my stepmother that I did. As long as I went to school and was there for babysitting, I could do anything I pleased, really. I just needed to be away on my own, with my own thoughts. One night, she promised to come back earlier, and she hadn't, and I knew she would be back soon, so I checked my sleeping baby sister and left the house. I knew it was wrong, but I was crumbling inside. And when I got back, there on the side was a dirty grey rag and a note telling me I was in a condition of liability yet again. All I could think of was what was wrong with these people. I took to going out more and more, and sometimes I met up with my friend who used to sneak out also. We took to hitchhiking all round the outskirts of East Grinstead. Neither of us thought there was anything wrong or dangerous in it. We just did it. We used to go and visit pubs and clubs and watch bands, and anything was better than Scientology as far as I was concerned. More than anything, I wanted love, and love was deluding me at all times. When you're a Scientology child, that isn't something you get any of, or very little of, at least anyway. That's my own experience, and I do know that is the experience of many other children who've gone through this. And that doesn't matter whether that was in 1967 or now. It stays the same, exactly the same. Stupidly, as a 12-year-old girl, I mistook sex for love, and I got myself into trouble, and I was caught by the police. I was taken into care, which was actually, unbeknownst to me at the time, probably the best thing that could have possibly happened to me, but I didn't realise that then. And my poor deluded stepmother said, "If you'd wanted sex, why didn't you say so? You could have come in the house." Such is the mind of a Scientologist. I was 12 years old. She was more concerned with the bad publicity it would cause for L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology, not for what it might do to her, not for what it might do to me, but for L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. Anyway, I wasn't really aware that I'd actually done anything wrong, and if anything at all, it made me feel slightly better to know that perhaps at long last Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard might actually be in trouble here. But of course they weren't. Anyway, I was put into an assessment centre for my safety. It felt like I'd been put in a prison, and I remember thinking I shouldn't be in prison, L. Ron Hubbard should. Worse was to come. Everybody in this assessment centre had to see a psychiatrist. Well, we had, from the time I could remember as a tiny little girl, we had been told how bad psychiatrists were. You don't see psychiatrists. The last thing on earth you would want is a psychiatrist. But here I was having to face one. I was only 12, and I'd spent 6 years learning how you shouldn't ever see one. So that was going to prove very difficult. He knew I'd been away at sea with my dad, so there was no denying that. But there was no way I could tell him of anything of what had happened to me. Excuse me. He asked me lots of questions, and I couldn't answer them. I knew nothing. I had to make up things as I went along, or give the... In actual fact, I gave the very basics. I thought he was trying to trick me when he tried to get me to do puzzles, and I still refused to answer. He told me the sooner I answered his questions, the sooner I wouldn't have to see him anymore. So I gave a short story based on I know nothing. It worked, and he did finally leave me alone. God knows what he must have thought of this strange child who'd been at sea for 2 years and didn't know anything. It was requested that my stepmother visit me, but she was so rude when she came, and she said she had 5 minutes and she had to get back to St. Hill. I remember crying and said to her, "Please get me out of here." Her reply was, "You pulled it in, so you deal with it." And she marched out. A couple of months later, I had to go and spend a weekend at home, and I played and baked with my little sister. The house was full of strangers, all Scientologists. They all talked Hubbard and Scientology and had these stupid glazed smiles on their faces. That night, they got up and went to bed and left me to put 2 chairs together and sleep on that. I vowed I would never go back ever again. Jumping ahead to several different sets of circumstances for me, life in care is like that. It was requested I go visit my stepmother and sister again. By now, they lived in Plymouth, and I didn't want to go. I didn't want to be anywhere near Scientologists. But eventually, I succumbed. My foster mother and my social worker worked on me continually. The first evening wasn't too bad. But the following day, under a ploy to get me to the local org, saying she had to pick up some work there, I found myself at the local org. And once inside, it was requested of me that it was about time I went on an e-meter. This is when I saw red. And I let rip, and I refused ever to go on an e-meter ever again. I told them what I thought of their stupid machine that didn't know nothing. And I got my belongings, and I left and returned back home on the next train. And it was shortly after this that I received a freeloader's bill. I got 2 in all, telling me I had to go back or pay this ridiculous amount of money. The crazy thing is, I was in care until I was 18, so even if I wanted to, I couldn't have gone. I ignored these letters, but was worried, which must have shown. The next time a social worker paid a call, he wanted to know if there was anyone demanding money off me. I said no, because I was still scared I was going to be locked up in a mental institution if I ever spoke out about any of this. He kept on about it, and my foster mother also, and she must have seen these letters to have known what was in them. So after he'd gone, I destroyed them. Nothing more was said about it. Another 6 months later, and I got a wedding invitation from my stepmother. My ever-vigilant foster mother must have seen this also, because she asked me if I was going. I said no, I wasn't. I would never be going there ever again. She encouraged me to go, and she'd obviously spoken to my social worker, because he tried to encourage me to go too. They just didn't get it, and I couldn't tell them why. But I wasn't going. I was absolutely convinced that if I did, they would kidnap me and I'd be back in the Sea Org again. That is how I thought about these people. And there was no way on earth I was going there. So bearing all this in mind, and I had to narrow it down very, very considerably. I hope I haven't bored you all. But A lot of people recently have been talking about hate the deed, not the person. Well, that's all well and good, but when you've had a childhood in Scientology, it's very easy to blame various people, because quite a lot of people are to blame, in actual fact. When people go around locking people up, I think they are to blame. When people order people locked up, I think they are to blame. But no, the deed is the thing that should be indeed hated. And I hate all of Scientology, every aspect of it. And I do so because of my childhood in Scientology. And when I see pictures of young children, someone called Darth Alexander has done some pictures of children coming off the Clearwater flag buses. And when I looked at those pictures, I saw me 45 years ago. And we can't have that. We can't have that anymore. That kind of thing has got to stop.